Hello Year 10, it's Mr Godman here and I'm looking forward to taking your history lesson today. And in this lesson we are going to start looking at how to write a narrative which analyses and explains. As usual, I'd like you to get yourself ready for the lesson. You will need your history workbook and a pen, and you might need some scrap paper. And I'd also like you to put away any distractions like mobile phones. If you need to, pause and get yourself ready, and then press play when you're ready to move forward. So here's your do now, and it's activity 8.1 in your workbook. Last lesson we were looking at the importance of NATO. So you've got 5 recall quiz questions here. As usual, I'd like you to try and do them without looking at your knowledge organiser or looking back at last lesson's notes. Pause now, have a go, and when you're ready, hit play. And here are the correct answers. So it's time to mark your own work now. Remember, if you get one of the questions wrong, just correct it, preferably in a different colour pen. And don't forget to give yourself a mark out of 5 at the end. Hit play when you're ready to move forward. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at how to write a narrative which analyses and explains. And this is one of the key things which you need to be able to do when you come to take your exam on the superpowers and the Cold War. We're going to start today with some revision on the First Berlin Crisis, and then we'll look at how to write a narrative. And finally, you're going to practice writing a narrative of your own. Usually, I ask you to update your knowledge organiser now. Well, we've covered quite a lot on our knowledge organisers over the last few lessons. So I want you to check that you've highlighted everything that we've covered, as you can see here. So we've come to the end now of this theme, the development of the Cold War, and we've finished looking at these 6 key events on our timeline. In today's lesson, when we're practicing writing a narrative, we are going to focus on the First Berlin Crisis, which we studied a few lessons ago. So it's time for your starter now, activity 8.2 in your workbook. And I've given you here 3 tables. Each table has one of the events of the First Berlin Crisis in it. And in each table you have 4 statements, A, B, C and D, which I'd like you to read. Now, for each of those statements, I want you to decide, is it a cause of the event or is it a consequence of the event? Remember, causes are the reasons why events happen, and consequences are the results of events. Now, you'll need to pause and have a go at this. And if you need to, you can go back and reread your notes on the First Berlin Crisis. When you're ready, hit play and we'll go through the answers together. Okay, so let's check our answers. You can mark your own, and of course, if you make a mistake, just correct it. So our first event was the Western Allies introducing a new currency, the Deutschmark, in Trizonia. First of all, we've got a consequence of that. Stalin was furious. We've got a reason why the Western Allies introduced the currency. We've got a result. Stalin reacted with a blockade. And we've got another reason why the Western Allies introduced this currency. Our next event was the Berlin blockade itself. We have a reason why Stalin blockaded Berlin. We have a result of the blockade. We have another result of the blockade, shortages in Berlin. And we have another reason why Stalin blockaded the city. And here's our final event, the Berlin airlift. We have a result or a consequence. Stalin called off his blockade. We have another consequence. Germany was divided formally into two countries. We have a reason why Truman launched the airlift. And we have another consequence here. West Berlin became a symbol of freedom behind the Iron Curtain. How did you do? When you're done marking, press play and we'll move forward. So now it's time to introduce some new knowledge. We're not going to introduce any new content here, but we are going to look at how to write a narrative which analyses. Now, a narrative is a little bit like a story, except it's a story which explains how and why things happen. So we have a question here that we're going to focus on. And the question is, write a narrative account which analyses the events of the First Berlin Crisis, 1948 to 1949. Now, straight away, we've been given a focus for our narrative. We have to focus on the First Berlin Crisis. So we're going to be explaining how and why that happened. We're also given a time frame that we need to stick to. So our time frame is 1948 to 1949. Now we've been given a starting point and an end point for our narrative. We're going to start with the Western Allies introducing a new currency, the Deutschmark, into their part of Germany. And the end point of our narrative is going to be the Berlin airlift. So, what do we need to do in our answer? Well, we need to follow several straightforward steps. Firstly, we need to write 3 paragraphs in total, and we don't need a separate introduction or a conclusion. We do need to write about 3 events in chronological order. Now, we already have event 1, the Deutschmark, and we have our final event, the Berlin airlift. We need 1 to go in the middle, and I'm going to suggest that you write about the Berlin blockade there. We have to include specific knowledge and detail in each of our paragraphs. And as well as telling the story of the First Berlin Crisis, we need to analyse. That means explaining how and why events happen. So we're going to need to use explaining phrases in our paragraphs. Finally, it's really important that we remember the last sentence of each paragraph should be a link to the next event in our narrative. So what does this actually look like when it's done well? Well, here's an example of a good model first paragraph. And what I actually want you to do here is to pause your video and read this. And I want you to think about what makes this a good model paragraph. I'd like you to write down anything which this student has done well in her paragraph. When you've done that, hit play and we'll move forward. So what has this student done which is really good? Well, I hope you notice her paragraph began with a big point that introduced the first key event in her narrative, the introduction of the Deutschmark. I hope you notice that this student has included some very specific knowledge in her paragraph. She has some key dates, some key events, some key people. These are factual details which show the examiner that she has a strong knowledge of the period. Thirdly, our student has used explaining phrases to say why things happened and why they were important. Look, we've got one here. They did this because. We've got another one here. This mattered because. So it's really important that you use those sorts of explaining phrases to explain why things happen. And lastly, the student finishes their paragraph with a link to the next event in the narrative. And in the case of this student, she's used a link to the second event in her narrative, the blockade of Berlin. And this is what you're aiming to do in your answer. So you're ready now for the main activity, and your job today is to have a go at writing this narrative account. Now remember, you have a copy of the success criteria in your workbook, and I'd like you to keep those in mind when you're writing your answer today. Well done in today's lesson, Year 10. Now, if you'd like to take this a little further, you could have another practice at writing a narrative account by having a go at this question. It's about the breakdown of the Grand Alliance, so you might want to go back and watch the video on our YouTube channel about that topic, and I'll put up a link for you to get to that in a moment. And that brings us to the end of the lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can do that by clicking the link here. I've also put up a link to that video on the breakdown of the Grand Alliance. And I'll look forward to teaching you next lesson when we're going to do a little bit more work on writing narrative accounts.